Hey everyone, welcome to our working group meeting today. I have the first agenda items. I'll go ahead and kick it off. I'm going to share my screen. Did everyone see my screen?
Yes.
Awesome. Okay, great. So a couple months ago, I brought this proposal to the community where we were proposing adopting release channels similar to what Gateway API has done in an attempt to allow more flexibility in terms of experimenting with new features while still being able to deliver a stable API. And just as a quick refresher, what that meant was we will now be introducing release channels. One will be an experimental channel versus a standard channel. And the experimental channel will be the one that has like the superset of all of our APIs, where we will have like both alpha and GA APIs, as well as fields that are either experimental or standard. And a more savvy Istio user can opt in to use that channel if they want to do experimental stuff. And the standard channel would be one that is sort of like a subset of all the APIs that we have, where we are ensuring that these APIs are GA quality and only has standard fields within it. So a user who is simply wanting to use, like, let's say, Safe Istio can be assured that they're indeed using like standard stable features by opting into the standard channel. So that was the background in terms of the release channel proposal. And since bringing it to the community, we have investigated how this will look in Istio, and we even did a POC of like the first phases of making this happen. So I'm hoping to show you all those concepts and that demo today and get the conversation going where we can get feedback. And the goal is to hopefully get this at a stage where we can release it in Istio 1.22. So with that said, this is the section that I'll be presenting on, which talks about the implementation of this. This issue is the one that we're using to like track all of the work that we have to do to make this happen in Istio. So feel free to like watch it if you're interested. And to begin, I wanted to start from like the user flow, where a Istio user, this is starting from like a net new um, cluster. A Istio user will attempt to install Istio, where they will have to specify the target release channel that they want to operate Istio in. And this is where they will set it to either be standard channel or experimental channel. And upon the installation of Istio, we will install all the relevant CRD/APIs for that target release channel. And then a user is now able to create a custom resource that has to conform to the schema of the installed CRD/API version for that target release channel. So that's like the user flow that we envision for user to interact with the release channels. And to get deeper into the details, like we understand at a high level what a channel is. It's really a bucket of like standard safe APIs versus experimental APIs. And in Istio, we are representing this as a combined YAML file. As of right now, we create our YAML file based on an open API generator. And if you're aware, we currently use this custom resource definitions.gen.yaml file as like the source of truth for all of our Istio custom resource definitions. And that is installed in Istio based on this ham-based chat template. So what we are proposing with the release channels is that we are actually going to generate more than one of these files for each channel, where we will now have like a standard.gen.yaml file, experimental, and we are proposing a legacy to aid with the transition period. Eventually, this legacy will go away as we define what is the easiest way to transition existing Istio to this. But for the most part, a user is consuming the release channel based on the custom resource definitions that we defined in this combined YAML file per channel. So with that said, let's see. So yeah, so in summary, this table attempts to represent what is actually happening in each channel based on the CRD definition and the YAML file. So the magic that we are relying on is that the custom resource definition that exists in the standard channel, those resources aren't aware of experimental fields or experimental resources. And whereas in the experimental channel, it is aware of all of the experimental versions, the resources, the fields, as well as like the standard channel stuff. So with that said, I'm not sure if you're all familiar with Kubernetes storage versions versus served versions, but this is how etcd will be able to be aware of like what is a valid schema for any custom resource that the user creates. Across the standard channel and experimental channel, the stored version of the CRD for standard will be that experimental version API, but it will not have the experimental fields in it. Whereas in the experimental channel, it will be another version of that experimental version API, but it has the experimental fields in it. And then for the served versions in the standard channel, the served version of the CRD will be the standard version as well as the experimental version without the experimental fields. And in the experimental channel, it will just be that experimental version with the experimental fields as well with the standard channel stuff. I forgot to include that there, but I will update it. But just know that the experimental channel is the superset of that standard channel. So whatever exists in standard channel will exist in experimental channel along with the experimental fields and resources. So that is like the summary of what will be happening to the CRDs. And in this table, I attempt to paint the picture of what the ideal end state will be for each one of our Istio CRDs. And of course, this is factoring that it will take several iterations and releases to actually remove certain versions of each CRD. And there are certain things that we still need to like define/consider. For instance, we have a lot of Istio CRDs that are in the V1 beta 1 type. We can introduce that to the standard channel as is, or to simplify things, we can promote that to V1, even though we know that we don't want to do any future development on it. And then, of course, there are some resources that have V1 Alpha 3, V1 Beta 1, V1 resources, and we can contemplate how quickly we want to remove some of these duplicated versions. But feel free to add your thoughts on the doc in regards to that, as this is more around like the demo. So moving on, as you can see, authorization policy is one of those CRDs that are currently V1 Beta 1. We know that we don't want to make any development changes to it as is. We consider it stable in an Istio world. So we are proposing that this policy can be added to the standard channel, ideally as the V1 version. In the destination rule case, this is one of those that has like a V1 Alpha 3 version out in the world. So we are proposing removing that V1 Alpha 3 version, promoting the V1 Beta 1 version to V1, and storing and just serving the V1 version of the destination rule.
Yeah, one question on this chart is that in the legacy channel destination rule, is that saying what's changing from legacy to standard, or is that saying that's what's going to be legacy, that V1 Alpha 3 is removed in the legacy channel?
This is saying that this is capturing the changes that we'll be doing on the resource as well as we are transitioning to the IDE world. So not necessarily it's going to move to standard, but it's just going to change.
But I thought legacy, the thing I'm confused about is I thought legacy was supposed to be what we have today. and this is
Yes.
not what we have today, and it's in the legacy column. So I'm not sure
Yes.
if it's wrong or
That's
if
a
I'm
good call out.
misunderstanding it, or
Yeah, it's wrong then. I need to update that.
Okay.
Legacy should emulate what exists in the current world.
Okay.
Can you make a clear statement in the document that the experimental channel will be 100% identical with the current Istio?
I wouldn't say it would be 100% identical. Legacy channel will be 100% identical.
Oh, legacy.
as
Sorry,
current
sorry,
system.
legacy. Yeah. Yeah, legacy. So legacy will be 100% what we have right now.
Yes.
Okay.
My bad, y'all. I overthought that.
And
Okay.
once again, what is the difference between legacy and experimental? Why
Legacy
do we need two
just
channels?
emulating what exists today, whereas experimental channel is literally the channel that has the standard as we want it to be, along with experimental. So a good example would be this telemetry API, right? If we promote telemetry API to V1, the standard channel will have like the V1 version of telemetry API along with like the V1 Alpha 1 version without the experimental fields, whereas the experimental version of this will just have the V1 Alpha 1 with the experimental fields along with like the standard channel, the standard version of it.
I'm not sure this will work very well. I mean, normally in Kubernetes, Kubernetes gateways, they don't have the V1 resource at all included in the experimental, so you cannot have it. I'm worried about users who may want to switch and use something in both channels because they'll have to use different resource CRDs. You'll not be able to create a chart that can be deployed in both.
Yes. So can you repeat your question, Custom? What's your concern there?
So I want to write a chart that is using some telemetry, and I want to
Mm-hmm.
deploy this chart in all three channels. So I may have some experimental cluster, I have a legacy cluster, I have a V1 cluster. I want to deploy this chart everywhere. Do I need to write the Helm template that is modifying the version, the API version of each resource?
So based on we are proposing that the stored version will be like the experimental version of that resource. So that's supposed to aid with the conversion between channels, because like I said, the experimental version to an extent is the superset of it all. Just when you're actually installing in, let's say, the standard channel, that experimental version will exclude certain fields that are experimental.
Okay, so you'll always use V1 alpha in the CRs, in the Helm chart, and
As
due
the
to
stored
this
version.
magic, okay, that's probably okay, not ideal, but okay-ish. I mean, it's not ideal for people to ask people to try V1 alpha 3 everywhere, but I guess they have a way to use it. Okay, never mind.
I'm not sure why people will have to write V1 Alpha 3 everywhere.
Because if they write V1 and they try to deploy in the experimental channel, it will not work. Since experimental channel don't have V1.
So how, regardless of the channel, Istio D and etcd will know of all the versions. Like the, for instance, in the standard channel, you're still aware that a V1 Alpha 1 version exists and a V1 version exists. So you don't necessarily have to reduplicate like writing V1 Alpha 3 everywhere. You can just, whatever your resource is, whatever your resource version is, you can take that to the new channel. What will change is the existence of a field or not, if that will be present in that channel's custom resource, if that makes sense. I see Keith's hand is up. Is that clear now? Or I should,
So
is
there
there
will
any
be
action
one
items for me
version,
to clarify?
Whitney, there will
Yeah.
be one version of the experimental resource that you see in experimental channel. It'll have all the fields. Then in the stable channel, you still have the experimental resource,
Mental version.
just
Correct.
without the experimental fields.
Correct.
And you have
Is
V1
that how
in all
Gateway API is doing it?
Yes.
So in terms of translating between versions and channels, it's in theory simple because all versions are aware in each channel.
What I like about that is that if you attempt to use an experimental feature in the stable channel, you get immediate feedback, right? That you're setting a field that doesn't exist. So that should fail validation, which is
And
nice.
that will work, yeah.
On the flip side, I'm trying to think of how we would connect the user to the idea that failing validation means they're using a resource from the channel. So if I go on Istio.io, I follow some instructions, or maybe I'm on Stack Overflow. Somebody's posted a solution. I copy and paste that resource and or the YAML, run it. I get a validation failure. I'm wondering what's going to help our users connect the fact that it's failing validation, not because they did anything wrong or there's anything wrong with Stack Overflow, but because they've actually opted into the wrong channel for that particular solution.
Yeah, I haven't thought about how we can surface that error, like add some customization to that error. But we will, as we educate the users around release channels, we will have to like emphasize that API versions is really set to a specific Istio and Istio release channel, Istio version and release channel.
Well, I think we'll have to be more specific than that because API version is a thing in Kubernetes, right? Kubernetes already has a construct for describing the API version. What we're going to do is have multiple distinct shapes of the API within a single API version, which is sort of unique plan.
Go ahead, Keith. And I'm not hearing you, Keith. I don't know if others are hearing you. And in regards to the legacy channel, the plan is for legacy channel to go away after a successful transition to release channels. So legacy channel is supposed to just be what exists in Istio as we transition. Still not hearing you, Keith, if you're talking.
Well, Whitney, while Keith figures out mic issues, I'll say I'm not opposed to this. I don't mean to be putting up roadblocks. I'm a little surprised by the way that API versions are being used here, and I need some time to wrap my head around it. It's very innovative.
And you're speaking in terms of how we are using, like we're calling something V1 Alpha 1 in both channels, but the version in one channel is different to the one in the other channel.
Exactly. We'll have two different views of what V1 Alpha 1 looks like.
Test, test, test. Can people hear me now?
Yes, much better, Keith.
Okay. Whew, sorry about that. So I to your point, Mitch, I think Gateway API has a similar problem. So if you look at HTTP route, there in the experimental channel, there is a timeouts field in the version of the resource, and the standard channel, there is no timeouts field in that version of the resource. The main way that users, as far as discoverability goes, figuring out what channel you're in is via labels / annotations. And so what we could, one option that we could do is to do provide kubectl commands or have an istio shortcut that will spit out what version or what channel is installed inside your cluster for debugging. And I think it will be a muscle that users might have to develop. But it allows us. What I like about this proposal here is that it allows us to provide a decent number of guarantees. I think when it comes to runtime safety with the control plane, while also giving us a place to be able to actually make iterations and changes that aren't going to affect 80% of our users, maybe 60, 70% of our users who should be on the standard channel. Again, +1 to what was in the chat before, I think about with respect to removing legacy at some point. I'm thinking that that's going to just mainly be a thing to help migration if we want to be able to experiment sooner rather than later. So long term, we'd only have two channels, I would think, unless somebody has a good reason why legacy needs to stick around.
Thanks, Keith.
Justin, I see your hand is up as well.
Yeah, I have a couple of points here on this topic, and I'm afraid that some of them are positive, some of them are not, so I'm a bit worried about. The mechanism itself, I think, is very good, and we should start experimenting with it. I mean, everything you have in this document probably needs to be treated as an experiment first and not jump to 3 channels,
Yes.
20. And part of this experiment, perhaps we, instead of starting the experiment with 3 different versions and all this complexity, maybe you can start with 1 or 2 resources that can go through this process and start having the V1 stable channel and gradually move stuff to V1 and keep legacy as stable as it is possible. Experimental channel, we can add it later because we need to validate that users like this are familiar and iron out all the problems and refine the process. And for that, it's much easier if you just start with 2. I mean, keep legacy slash experimental, and then have few resources in stable. Now, that's a real problem. What do we put in stable? That's what I'm super worried about because we have, ambient that is coming with a subset of the API, which is mostly HTTP route and, gateway, the other one. And some fields work, some fields don't work. So we are going to have 3 channels, three API variations with Istio Sidecar, plus 1 or 2 variation in ambient. Presumably, we'll also have experimental and stables there, plus the gateway API itself. So how many? 6, 7 already, and it's hard. I don't know.
I think in terms of what moves to stable, I believe like for instance let me see where I outlined it. 1 second. So we have like these existing V1 beta 1 CRDs that even with ambient, we know for sure most of these are going to exist as is. Like there's no development work to improve it, and it probably wouldn't even. It might be replaced by something ambient specific in the future, but for the most part, main Istio still relies on these, and therefore, since we don't want to do any graduation work, we want to sort of adopt it as like a pseudo Istio stable feature.
Yeah, that's actually even worse. That's even worse because destination role, for example, I mean, we have we have the variation with target ref, we have the variation with workload selector, we have some behaviors that even if they have the same CRD, they are very different. I mean, client override, for example, probably will not work in ambient or HTTP, and it's creating a lot of other problems. So we have. Even if we give the impression that it's a stable API, it's actually subsets of the APIs that, depending on how you look at it, they work or don't work.
I see.
I mean, I don't have a solution. I just have concerns right now. I mean, my personal thinking was that at some point we'll just use the HTTP route and the policies as stable, and keep legacy as it is, and not introduce more complexity for the poor users of the current API. But
Okay.
with this mechanism, we need the mechanism anyway for the even if we go this way. But during experimentation for this, probably we'll get some feedback and figure out if this is tractable or it's too much for everyone.
Okay, I understand your concern, and it sounds like we just need to do an effort similar to what we are doing with telemetry API to really define out the subsets of fields within each of these resources we should promote to stable. Benjamin, I see your hand is up.
Yeah, I guess some of this is talking about the side channel, but I guess yeah, the idea that legacy eventually will go away. I had these questions in the doc too, but like the criteria under which stuff might move from standard to legacy, and also I think you touched on this briefly as like a sort of aside, how long stuff would stay in legacy. It may be a little early to define all that, but I think that is actually important. And I think what Mike is saying in the chat is interesting too. The idea that maybe we start with legacy because we know what that looks like, and we start with experimental because we know what that looks like, and we do standard as we go. So maybe that sort of just looks like two things to begin with. I don't know, that a staggered approach. Like that's the thing I think I really just have concerns about is the boundary between legacy and standard. And it sounds like nobody really knows yet what that boundary is. So we might need to be a little flexible on that in the short term. But yeah, the other question I had too was, I know John a couple of weeks ago merged compatibility versions, which is a design that lets you like say, I want to install Istio compatibility version 120, but I'm using 121. How does that do you see that intersecting with this at all, or does it? Because I'm trying to understand how you would use both of these things, or if you would.
I believe there's an intersection. I just haven't done the work to figure that out as yet.
Yeah.
And I'll have to collaborate with John on that.
I think we need this though. Like I do again, like Mitch was saying, this is good, and I don't want to block it, but there's a lot of rocks that have to be lifted up and looked under to make all this stuff work, which we all have to deal with.
Yeah, it's a heavy lift. And going back to your first question, I think it has a response to it as well. I will actually say that I believe the standard channel is the biggest delivery here. So it will be good for us to like come to some form of consensus in terms of like, if we are doing it staggered, which one is like the greatest value add? And in my opinion, that is the standard channel. So I will hand the mic to Keith now.
Yeah, this is interesting to me, hearing a lot of the feedback. It's really helpful. I appreciate it from everybody. I think for me, I was going through Whitney's proposal, I always read it differently, where in my mind, the legacy channel is more of a point in time copy of what exists today, and it more tracks experimental rather than standard. Like in my mind, I guess, and part of this is probably biased from some of the stuff I did I was looking at a while ago with Safe Istio, but I see standard channel as the new thing. Legacy is effectively still experimental because it contains Envoy filter, it contains WASM plugin, it contains those resources that are not really that we don't.
Stable. Legacy does not imply stable, basically.
Exactly. Yeah, that's what I'm trying. Yeah, exactly. So legacy is there to help people to migrate and to give them time. But moving forward, experimental is going to get a lot rockier. Standard's going to be kind of the safe, smooth waters, and then legacy is just kind of keeping the status quo for a while, so users can figure out what camp they fall into and can give. From a community standpoint, I responded to John a little bit in the doc. But from a community standpoint, it allows us to prioritize our efforts towards things that users really, really need that aren't anywhere except for experimental, like rate limiting or anything like that, where you can only get it within WASM plugin or Envoy filter.
That strategy makes a lot of sense, but I do think the messaging around that needs to be clear, because just reading the names and like all the baggage that they have in the software world doesn't necessarily convey that.
Yes, and I think I added confusion with the legacy channel as well. So I'll definitely add clarity to that in the doc. John, you want to go ahead?
Yeah, I just wanted to say I have to drop off, but I think this is definitely trending in the right direction. The details of this will matter a lot because it's, I don't know, it's very easy to get wrong. But looks like we're on the path, and I will make sure to give a thorough review, maybe after you go update it, so I don't get confused on on the table. But overall, sounds like that's kind of the general consensus as well. So Much appreciation for working on this. One general thing is like some of the stuff we're saying, like virtual service V1, like those actually aren't V1 today. So if it's not already on there that I missed, we should probably also talk about getting things that aren't stable to stable and what that's going to look like. And that could be as simple as I declare it V1 now, but we should at least, state what the plan is there. So
Agreed. I will ping you when the doc is a go ahead and review.
cool. Thanks. Bye.
So, John, I slightly disagree that virtual service should move to V1. That's the other thing. I mean, we have HTTP route as V1. We should not have virtual service as well as V1. HTTP route is a V1 for virtual service routing, I think.
I think John had to drop
think-
off.
Yeah, but something to discuss maybe in the next meeting, since I see one more agenda topic and want to just throw in a quick time check.
Okay. So let's see. So this table, please review it and add thoughts. I think one of the biggest takeaway from what we discussed is we can't just automatically promote all the V1 beta 1 types. So we'll have to have a more explicit plan there, as well as to take this transition in phases. So with that said, let's go to like how we actually implementing this if we are interested, or should I pause for now?
Let me see. Is anybody here for the second agenda topic and can speak to how long it's going to take?
Yes.
Oh, looks like they dropped. So it looks like the rest of the time is yours if you want it, Whitney.
Okay, perfect. So getting into the details, right now our API is defined as like proto definitions in our API repository. And we have multiple versions across V1 Alpha 1, 3, V1, and so on. How we are pretty much controlling our channel generation logic is by using annotations in the form of comments in each CRD definition, where the two annotations, or it's really one annotation that we are adding, and we are adding that annotation to experimental resources. So for instance, the proxy config, the envoy filter resource, we'll add this annotation to that resource level, and that will tell the generator, this is an experimental resource only generated in the experimental channel. And then we're adding the same annotation at the field level for experimental fields that exist in the V1 and V1 Alpha 1 custom resource definition. So with that said, I can go ahead and show you all the code changes that we did. So if you're interested, this is the draft PR that's tracking that work. And let's get into it. So I'll show, right now we are using like our local API repository where we added some of the annotation tags. So as you can see, at the envoy filter resource level, we have this tag that we introduced where we are setting the release channel to experimental. And then in the telemetry resource, we also added an annotation that sets custom tags. Let's see. That sets the custom tags field as experimental. And in our tools repository, I'm not sure if you're familiar, but we have our own custom CRD generation tool. We have set up the generator to understand the experimental field/resource concept, where we specify the channel definitions here, where as of now we have these 3 channels. Of course, we can adjust this based on what we actually decide to do with the channels that we want to introduce. But as you can see right here, we have like this tag that says, this Boolean that says include experimental or not. In standard, in the standard channel, we do not want experimental included. So that's where we set as false. And then from there, as you can see, when the files are loaded and the generator is reading each file to see what to generate, what CRD to generate, it looks for the, one second. It first starts at the resource level, where it looks to see if this resource is an experimental resource or not. If this resource is experimental and include experimental is set to false, we skip generating that specific resource, and we continue on to the other resources. And then at the field level, if for some reason this resource is not experimental, but it contains an experimental field, when it reaches that field with the experimental field annotation, it will skip that generating that field. And the end product will be the combined custom resource definition YAMLs with the relevant APIs and fields that should match for the channel. So based on those changes, I can do a test. I can do one run where in our API repository, I'm pretty much gonna run our local version of the CRD generator. And as you can see, we are able to create the 3 YAML files for each channel that we set here. And if we look at the generation trace, you can see that when we got to the WASM plugin, we skipped creating that experimental resource in the channel, in the standard channel. And then at the field level, let's see what happened. Okay, so I'll move on from there. All right, so next up, let's compare the standard and experimental YAMLs that were created. So on the left is the standard and the right is the experimental. And as expected, the WASM plugin is an experimental resource, so it doesn't exist in the standard channel. Same with like the Envoy filters, that's an experimental resource, so it does not exist in the standard channel. And then in the telemetry API, the custom tag, we set that as an experimental field, so it does not exist on the standard channels version of the telemetry API. But if you look closely at the standard channel API, you can see we have the V1 version as well as the V1 Alpha 1 version. And if you look at the storage, the V1 Alpha 1 version is the version that is set to be the storage version in the standard channel. And both the V1 and the V1 Alpha 1 versions are served. So this is the same in experimental, where the V1 Alpha 1 version is set as the storage version. So going back to like a point that Custon raised earlier, all channels do indeed know of the same versions, but it's just within the resource itself, there are differences. Let's see. Oop. Yeah, and that pretty much ends my demo. So this is the experimental. And in the experimental, we just have the V1 Alpha 1, which is the storage. Cool. Is there any questions? Well, thank you all for the feedback. Feel free to continue reviewing the doc, as well as this is the parent issue that we are tracking the work here. Feel free to keep an eye on that, and there's where we will be adding all of our PRs as well. Thanks for everyone's feedback and assistance. Is there any other agenda items?
I think that's it.
I think Satish might have a topic to discuss. I don't know if that's for today or later.
Yeah, we'll add to the agenda item. I just requested for the edit access for the document. If you can give me the access, probably I'll add the agenda item from the next meeting.
If you could suggest, go in Google Docs and change your remote from editing to suggest, that'd probably be faster. Edit access is restricted to Istio members, and there's a section in our doc explaining how to become an Istio member. You have to submit a PR. But if you can make a suggestion in Google Docs, we'll be happy to apply it.
Yeah, sure. Santosh, you have anything?
Yeah, actually, we didn't see a way to give the as a suggestion also. So on the same document we tried, but it's asking for a request to edit.
Oh, interesting. Okay. If you tell me what your topic is, then I can add it for the doc here. Sorry about that. We'll look into that.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, let me I'll give the 1 minute.
Yeah, as I think Keith said earlier, I think if you just, so in the upper right, there's like a pencil, which is the editing icon. If you just change that from editing to suggesting, I think that might work.
Yeah, this is the issue that we want to discuss. I just pinged it. I'll try that. The icon itself is a request edit access only.
Yeah, that we need to look into that, because I was under the impression that non-members could suggest, but if not, we need to make sure that that's functionality gets re-enabled.
Yeah, please. Yeah, that will be better. So for now, maybe it will be helpful if you just add this to the next meeting agenda. Then we can go over and then discuss.
Yeah, absolutely.
Thanks, Kate. Thanks.
Thanks all for your good action.
No problem. Any other topics? All right. I think we're done. Thanks, everybody. See some of you in the ambient meeting.
Thank you.